Welcome everybody on this Drier day. I think it's quite a nice time to be inside. I'll do the formal bit first and remind everybody, if you haven't already, put your phone to silent. Can you please do that? The sessions are all going to be filmed today, so if you're asking a question and you don't want to be filmed, let the crew know, or sort of stick at the back. And this is an inclusive and diverse event, so would encourage everybody to keep their language and questions polite and professional and kind. So I'll quickly introduce the panellists, and then I'll hand over the mic for them to introduce themselves a bit more fully. And then we'll start, I'll sort of ask one or two questions, and then we'll kind of open up to the floor for people to ask questions as we go through. And, you know, questions will just sort of come as people introduce themselves and what they do. So we've got Murray Cooper, an organic mixed farmer from Aberdeenshire, Gary Catto from Highland Grain Co-op, Kathryn Hamlen, I had to remind myself your surname, Barley breeding from Syngenta, and Emily Pope from Trinity Farms Global, Director of Knowledge Exchange. So I'll start with Murray. Is your microphone working, or do you need this one?
Hi.
Oh, there we go.
I am Murray Cooper, farm just not far from Aberdeen. We've been organic 2006, running about 160 cows and 1,100 sheep, and up to about 500 acres of combinable crops. Grow a good mixture, seed barley, seed wheat, seed peas, beans, organic oilseed rape, and usually a good mixture of everything together as well. Last few years we've brought in inter-row weeding and trialling various different things with that.
Hi folks, my name is Gary Catto. As I said, I work for Highland Grain Limited. We're a farming cooperative based in the Black Isle, just north of Inverness. We handle predominantly spring barley in the region of about 40,000 tonnes every year for my 80-odd amazing farmer members. I've been in the role now for about 5 years, and I've come from a different sector, so it's like rabbit in the headlights, wider perspective sort of thing. And it's our catchment area covers from Golspie in the north all the way down through Easter Ross in the Black Isle, Inverness-shire, and along the Murray coast as far as Kinloss. So we get a huge, diverse farm type from light sandy ground at sea level all the way up to heavy clay at sort of 200-300 feet above sea level. So a right mix of farming experience there.
Thank you, and pass along to Kathryn.
Hi everybody, I'm Kathryn Hamlen. I'm the marketing manager for cereals in the UK and Ireland. Syngenta is the breeder of quite a few of malting barleys over the past couple of years that you probably remember, such as Optic, Tipple, Quench, Propino, and now probably a few of you know the variety Laureate, as well as the winter malting barleys, Craft, Electrum, SY Vessel, and also we are a cereal grower, so a breeder for the wheat varieties as well.
Morning everyone, my name's Emily Pope and I'm Director of Knowledge Exchange at the Trinity Natural Capital Group. So the Trinity Natural Capital Group is made up of 3 companies. You might have heard of one of them, which is Trinity AgTech, and we have produced a software called Sandy, which is a natural capital navigator. So includes different sustainability modules such as carbon footprinting, but also looking at biodiversity and water at the same time. We have a trading platform for things like carbon credits and biodiversity tokens, and that's part of the Trinity Natural Capital Markets. And then the company that I work for is Trinity Global Farm Pioneers, which is the knowledge exchange side of the firm. So working with project groups or discussion groups, networks of farmers, different initiatives across the whole of the agricultural industry, bringing researchers and farmers together to exchange their ideas, best practices, what's worked, what hasn't worked on farm.
Thanks. So I didn't read out the whole synopsis for the discussion at the beginning, but the main kind of aims of the discussion today are to think about, or to kind of speak among the audience and the panellists, what are the effects of the changing climate that are already happening on people's farms, what's on people's minds in terms of the challenges or the opportunities that people are facing, what's the impact on crop growth, farm operations, what are farmers doing already, to have a think about that, what are farmers thinking about doing or questioning should they be doing. That kind of brings in the role of knowledge exchange and kind of collaboration and working with different organisations. And then I think the kind of aim as well, or a useful outcome, is to think about what are the real priorities for innovation, research, knowledge exchange, sort of crop breeding and that sort of thing, to be going forward. What are people's questions in the audience about what those priorities should be? So think about those sort of questions for the panellists. So I think we'll start off maybe with Gary and Murray. What are the sort of impacts that you're seeing already from the changing climate, the weather being quite extreme? What are the impacts on your growers in terms of their sort of decision making, their day-to-day farm operations? Are you seeing a big impact on crop growth and things like that? Or is it things that people are worrying about?
I think so. We've got a couple of farms within the group who monitor rainfall and weather and have done for the last sort of 20 years. And so every month I get an update on rainfall, and it's all in the same spreadsheet. And you can really see a trend. That there were always outlier years where there'd be long dry spells or long wet spells. And although my experience within this industry only stretches 5 years, within that 5 years, we've had, 2 long dry summers. We've had some really long wet harvests. We've had, it's almost like there's a seasonal blend. You don't get that change from one season to another. And as far as changes on farm, I think it is really starting to focus the minds of a lot of people to say, well, what can I do different? As far as answers, I'm not sure that they're as defined as we would like. You've got what works on a farm in the south coast of Devon isn't going to work on a farm in the outskirts of Golspie in the Highlands. What works on one of my member farms on the east coast of Murray isn't going to work on the top of the Black Isle on heavier soil. So there's no straight answers really, but there's definitely a change in attitude towards, or thinking that something needs to change. When we look at the spring barley varieties, again, I don't know many of the older ones because I wasn't in the job, but a lot of the newer varieties which have been bred for yield, like Laureate and Arable, etc., some fantastic yields compared to their predecessors, but they're that little bit later. And that's an issue when, certainly for my membership, when, this summer in the Highlands isn't as great as everybody makes out it is. So when the harvests start getting that little bit later, it puts a lot of pressure on not just the farm to get it off the field, but to get it dried on storage space. Everything's that little bit more under pressure. So no straight answer as to what the solution is, but I thought I'd just highlight some of the complexities around, the different ways that different farmers have to start viewing the problem, really.
Challenges that I'm seeing are mainly getting water when we need it. A wet year can make any farmer look good, and we'd certainly need that being organic.
And in terms of breeding, the sort of priorities for things like yield and, how that sits, is there anything that you want to add into that just now?
So from a malting barley perspective, we are looking very much for a couple of things. We obviously do want to increase yield, but absolutely take Gary's point. maturity has been something that particularly Scottish and Northern growers have been highlighting to us for many years is incredibly important. So it's the longer a variety is able to harvest the sunlight energy, the bigger the yield it can build. But particularly when we're looking at potentially loss of things like desiccants as well in the future, then it's more and more important to bring through maturity as well. So we're looking at a range of things. We're trying to bring in increased yields, but quality, particularly from a malting barley perspective, is always a number one priority. So we are trying to bring through both the quality, the yield, but then looking at the agronomics as well. Now, that's pretty much what all the breeders are looking for in this area. But the other thing now that's becoming more and more apparent is that consistency is something that is needed, particularly with the changing in climatic conditions each year, as we've already highlighted. So from our perspective, how do you breed for something that is consistent when you have a finite amount of time? So to bring through a variety from first cross to actual commercialization takes 7 to 10 years. But if you can imagine that you don't actually have that much seed to be able to test it until the last 3 years, which is the registration and the recommendation process. So at that point, you've got 3 years, small amount of seed to actually test it. Now, each season is very different. And so we are now trying to combine different techniques before we get to that point where we can hopefully predict for stability as well and other kind of traits. So we call this genomic selection. And this is looking at both the genetic fingerprint of different varieties along with how they look in the field, so their phenotypes. And the more and more data we have on this, we can start to predict how well a variety will be stable throughout the years. So even though we've only been able to test it for 1-2 years on small plot scales, at that point we have this new technique that combines genetics as well as phenotypes to be able to try and predict how stable a variety would be.
Okay, and before I sort of open up to questions, I'll ask Emily as well. What are the sort of challenges that you're seeing from the farmers that you work with, and what are the sort of things that they're talking about in terms of what their challenges are or what they're thinking about?
Yeah, so I'm very lucky. I get to work with a wide selection of farmers and farm businesses across the country and actually globally as well. So getting to know those farmers, their challenges, and how they're adapting to climate change. But I think it's quite a good opportunity to bring to the conversation the difference between adapting or adaptation and mitigation. And actually, agriculture is in such a unique position to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And actually, on farm, what I'm seeing is people who are trying to strike that balance between adaptation and mitigation. So obviously, like, the varieties play such an important role, and many of the farmers that I work with are looking at their variety selection, so in terms of stability of varieties. But actually, is this an opportunity for us to really challenge ourselves and diversify our rotations, diversify the varieties that we're using, and totally taking on point what Gary said about not everything works on every farm, and you'll have to adapt it slightly to your system. And I'm a massive fan of on-farm trials for that very reason. But I think in terms of what I'm seeing on farm and what people are looking at is really striking that balance between adaptation and mitigation. And we could probably go into that in a lot more detail later on. But yeah, there's lots of techniques that people are using in terms of reducing tillage or using cover crops, as well as backing that up with some of the adaptation techniques, such as the variety selection.
Thanks. Are there any questions yet? Oh, there's a couple. Doug, I think you were fastest hand first.
I would like to ask the panel what their thoughts are on varietal blending of varieties for sowing, because I know James Hutton, correct me if I'm wrong, they did research quite a while ago on the barley varieties, and they found that they blended varieties. They got more consistent yield and more consistent quality out of it. But I appreciate on the end user might not quite like that, but certainly on the breeding front, I think there are advantages, possibly advantages on that side, but I'd like to know what the panel think.
Hi. No, that's so from a cooperative perspective, where we're selling to the end user, well, not directly, but the maltsters, there isn't much of an appetite to malt a mix unless they really have to. Although there are occasions where I have spoken to a couple of maltsters, and they will do maybe a 70-30 mix of like Laureate to, I think it was Concerto at one point, and then vice versa. What they're looking for in the malting process is it to be really uniform, with as few variables as possible, so that their steep times could be more accurate. So I suppose the question I would have is what, the mixing in the field, ultimately, if it adds value to the supply chain, that value would have to be recognised by the maltsters, who are ultimately the ones we're selling it to.
Do you want to add to that, Kathryn?
Yeah, I would agree on the quality side. If there was, it might be better to do it sort of with a feed variety potentially, and then you can see the benefits there. We've done quite a few trials looking at the winter cereals, and we have seen some benefits with things like disease as well, and also standing strength on some of the winter barley cereals as well. So there are definite benefits, but when it comes down to the quality, then it's very much end user driven.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and the topic of carbon has obviously come up quite quickly. From a climate change perspective, obviously it's hot topic and front and centre of people's minds. Something that I'm quite keen to challenge us to think about is that climate change isn't just about carbon, and actually with some of these blends, I'll be interested to know, based on experience of growing them, does that also allow you to reduce potentially insecticides or fertiliser, because there's this complementary system that you're producing? And from a climate change perspective, yes, that's good for carbon, but is it also good for biodiversity? So, interested if anyone's got any experience on that.
Thank you. We've got another question over here.
George Laurie, Chairman of International Barley Hub, and wearing 2 or 3 other hats as well. Establishment is a big challenge within agriculture, especially in Scotland, because we've got a very short window to get that crop back in the ground. One of the things that we can reduce our carbon with is reducing tillage. But what we're actually finding is that spring barleys don't do well with reduced tillage. Farmers go back to the old ploughing combination every time to get the yield, to get the establishment better. Can we look at breeding that would select better barleys that would be established better through reduced tillage?
Say that one. Yes, so it's a really great question. So you will notice outside there's a lot of trials that are in small plots. If any of you have seen a small plot drill before, it's quite different from your normal farm drill. And there's a couple of things. First of all, it's incredibly difficult to do any kind of trials on a small plot drill in different tillage situations. We've actually got a drill that is kind of halfway between both a small plot drill and a farm drill that enables us to do some slightly different trials. So we have been looking at different varieties in different cultivation techniques, and we've been doing it for a number of years now. And exactly what you've said, we found it's much more difficult to do it with spring barley. It's easier to do we're finding better differences with the wheats and the winter wheat and the winter barley. And actually, all it comes down to a lot of the time is establishment, so moisture and seed to soil contact, which is far more variable when you've got this much smaller drilling window. The key thing is rooting, and that is something that we we haven't looked at a great deal. It's much more difficult to see what's going on underground than it is above ground. So when you're breeding, obviously selecting, you're using your eyes, selecting, seeing what's above ground. And so below ground is much more important. It's something that we are trying to work on a little bit more. Throw into that different types of tillage, and seeing what's going on underground is much more difficult. But yes, what we are now trying to do is see if we can find any genetic markers that might indicate different rooting structures and how that goes through, and selecting parents that way. But it's for the future. But we can agree exactly what you found. We've found very different, very similar things.
Thanks. Does anybody want to add anything else? Yeah, sure.
Hi, George. I think the other consideration I think here is that, it's margins are so tight at the minute, and we're all talking about changing farm practices or things that we do on farm. And I know from speaking to all my members that, and from managing Highland Grain itself, there are lots of things that I could do to reduce our carbon footprint, but at the minute it's not cost effective. And it's this, it's the same premise on your own farms, that we just need that cost versus benefit calculation to fall into place. If not, there's going to be a lot of guys suffering, especially in the Scottish picture.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay. Yeah, one at the door there. Do you want to come in out of the rain a wee bit?
Hello. I was wondering if you foresee any changes in the types of cereal we grow, from the more niche ones to becoming into the mainstream, like rye and triticale, in response to the changing climate. Is there any cereals that would perhaps be more useful in a future climate change-stricken world?
And you've got maltsters that are malting 70, 80, 90, 100,000 tonnes worth of malt every year. If the farmer wants to grow a variety that's only yielding 2.1 tonne instead of 2.76 tonnes, is there going to be a premium on that? And are they going to be able to get it in the volume that they need to satisfy their end user, the distillers? I think, Scotland historically over the last number of years, or for quite some time, has operated at a malt deficit. So we've been taking malt in from Europe or across the border. That has changed slightly over the last couple of years with investments with Baird's Malt in Inverness and Burt Malt down the Buckie Coast. Simpsons are looking to put new maltings in it, Rothes. So these things are all caused a shift in the supply chain, but ultimately that supply chain sits on a common variety, mostly laureate. I think it's about 55-60% at the minute. And it's great to look at these varieties. I know guys that grow all the weird and wonderful things, but they're very small niche markets. And I think the chances of those small niche markets becoming the primary are almost slim to none, if I'm being honest.
Thanks. Oh, yeah. 1 second, David. We'll just let Emily respond first.
Just very quickly, so on farm, yes, seeing, and I should say caveat, I do most of my work probably south of the border, which hoping to change, so I'm here all day. But from a climate change perspective as well, joking about working south of the border, but actually we need to think beyond the UK, it's global climate change, and whatever we do here, whatever we change, so maybe switching to more niche varieties or crops in themselves, someone else will pick up that production, and that production could be picked up somewhere else in the world where their environmental footprint, their social footprint, there's much more that goes just beyond the production of food that's tied up in that food production system. Someone else will pick up that drop in production here. We refer to it as carbon leakage from a carbon footprinting perspective. But yeah, I do work with lots of farmers who are trying these different crops, but they're very, very aware that wheat production, for example, or barley production is being picked up elsewhere. And essentially, we could be offshoring our responsibilities for climate change by allowing somewhere else to pick that up.
Thanks, Emily. David?
Yeah, so there was a few questions. I think, and the responses to them were about the supply chain not paying for some of the costs, additional costs, or the supply chain not taking blends, or the supply chain not taking particular varieties. So I think we probably all need to change with this climate change thing. And the question for the panel is, how do we get the supply chain to change and accept these differences that farmers are going to have to do?
Oh, you won't answer that one.
There is an appetite for change within the supply chain. And there's been a huge amount of change within the supply chain. I'm only talking from the distilling one here. You know, the amount of investment at distiller level is phenomenal in renewables, AD plants, using air liquide and, you know, changing their setup on their energy use. Maltings are the same. So we're not saying that they're not changing to help the environment and sustainability. There's a huge amount of investment. But when you're talking about the core product, you know, a change from, say, Laureate back to, I'm sorry, I couldn't remember the Midas, that is a huge step change. And you know, I mean, I don't even know, what would it yield? Okay, so that's not a million miles away from where we are. Anyway, so, but there needs to be, that change needs to be incentivized. And just because it's there doesn't mean to say it's going to be used. So I think when you're saying about the supply chain not changing, it'd be a huge amount of change within the supply chain, investment and all sorts. But to answer your question, how do we facilitate further change? The only way I see that happening, which has been happening over the last sort of 18 months to years, is more conversations between the end user, the maltster, the grower, and myself as a co-op manager. I would say that, I mean, I've only been in the job 5 years. When I first started, trying to get a conversation across the whole supply chain was very, very difficult. Now it's quite common. Almost brought about by the sort of energy crisis. It focused the minds at all points of the supply chain. And the fallout from that was that I do now sit around the table with maltsters, distillers, growers, and there's more of an understanding of the whole supply chain than there ever was. So there has been change. We just have to hope that the change keeps going in the right direction, which I feel it will.
Thanks. Does anybody want to add anything into that? Any further questions? So, Ali's got one.
Sorry, I couldn't miss the opportunity because I think somebody, might have been Emily, mentioned diversification as one of the things that farmers are thinking about in terms of adapting. I was wondering, with the panel's expertise, maybe from a farmer's perspective, maybe Murray, you could say something about how because I think you're doing a lot of diversification, how that helps you with adaptation, but also more widely, Emily, maybe you could say what you're seeing in the wider farming community.
Recent years we've moved from just growing seed barley, seed oats for milling, and wheat, which is a struggle to get good yields organically, and we've gone to then growing oilseed rape, which is probably the biggest challenge ever. Grow perfectly when you don't want it to, but when you do try and grow it, so the reward has to be there and the market has to be there. So with organic, with organic, how do you find getting a route to market with the organic product? Because I know from my experience that we've had some growers in our group wanting to try organic spring barley, but finding a home for it is quite difficult, and that's just one crop. Yeah, with everything, you have to have somewhere to either sell it or use it yourself. And using it yourself doesn't really make you any money. So,
Are there ways that it can sort of help, make the whole system more efficient if you're sort of taking a whole system approach?
Yeah, so like some organic oilseed rape, we've collaborated with 5 or 6 different farmers are now growing it for one producer to bring it to market as oil for human consumption. So,
Yeah, so that's sort of the direct marketing, and again, I guess linking from consumers and having that shorter supply chain is one way to kind of help those conversations and tell that story. For things like the oilseed rape and the oil. to have a direct market. And I'll pass over to Emily, and then there's a question at the back.
I've literally just written down in front of me short supply chains, so we didn't plan that. But just based on the farmers that I work with, so things like, and I know again with the big caveat that it doesn't always work everywhere. So this is certainly not a recommendation or prescription to anyone here, but livestock in the rotation, cover crops, things like agroforestry, silvopasture. Obviously that creates diversification, but inevitably supports mitigation and adaptation in terms of climate change. Businesses with a short supply chain, that's really important, that direct route to market, especially with, I guess, easier maybe on the livestock and the dairy side of things, sometimes a bit more complicated in the longer supply chains, especially with cereals or arable crops. A really good example of a farmer that I work with, someone called Tim Partons. He's based down in Staffordshire. I don't know if anyone's heard of him, but he's director and co-founder of an organisation that's been set up by a group of 6 farmers called the Green Farm Collective. They're all doing really interesting things. It's a membership organisation as well, so you can find out information online. But one of the things that Tim is doing is working with local businesses who actually support, essentially sponsor biodiversity on his farm in the form of planting flowering strips, which, to be fair, he does a lot of anyway, integrates them into his farming system. But this is a local flooring company, and yes, it's good PR for them. They can then go to their customers and say, we're supporting this farm business. But one of the things that is part of that arrangement, part of that sponsorship, is Tim then hosts the employees of the flooring company to come out onto farm. They do biodiversity surveys. He's set up a bird hive, so the employees come out, they learn about the farm. So it's not just a transaction of here's some money, plant some flowering strips. It's engaging with essentially people who are his customers at the end of the day as well, in one way or another. I think it's worth bearing in mind the different types of carbon credits. So you can have reduction credits, retention credits, and removal credits. So reduction credits would be if you say for 1 year, I'm going to reduce the amount of fuel I use on my farm. That's a 1-year contract. So you're not tying yourselves into a long-term contract, which would be for retention credits, for example. So carbon sequestration in the soil or in hedges or trees, they start at 10-year contracts. Removal credits are where you would switch to, say, like a biofuel, so you're removing what would have been emitted. So in terms of, what the supply chain and what the market would pay for, it would really depend on what kind of credit it is, because they have different values. And then in terms of the value of those credits, so as an organisation, the Trinity Natural Capital Group do not buy carbon credits. It's a little bit like a dating site for farmers and buyers, or sellers and buyers. You decide as a farmer, as a land manager, you decide the value of your carbon credit. We can indicate what the average market price is, say like £35 to £40 a tonne. But you're the one that has generated that carbon credit, the effort that you've put in, the strategic thinking, the planning and the action. You decide the value of that credit. You sell your story to the buyer via our platform. We can support, in terms of the contracting and the legal side of things, but it's your job to negotiate that price. So just as an example, one of the Green Farm Collective farmers, Michael Kavanagh, who's down in Shropshire, he sold carbon for £100 a tonne, because he was able to bundle it in with the biodiversity score that he's got on his farm using the software Sandy. So you can see how, the range of carbon credits, the value changes depending on what they are, but also depending on your story and how much you're prepared to sell your story to the buyers.
Gary?
Yeah, this carbon quest that we're all on, if we look at it from, like you said, the Highland grain perspective of the spring barley, the waters are still very muddy around what has been asked for and what you as a spring barley grower needs to do. So, carbon neutral barley, let's be honest, unless, it need to be offset elsewhere in the farm, et cetera, the main culprits are fuel and fertiliser, and until we get decent alternatives of both, we're not going to be able to have a huge impact on the CO2e per kilogram of ton output of barley across my weighbridge. As for what the supply chain is looking for, that depends who your customer is. So we have several calculators out there. All of them are fine, but they will all give you varying answers. Some arms of the supply chain might ask you to complete it on X, while others are asking you to complete it on Y. And all this is doing is causing a lot of people to put their head in the sand and ignore the fact that carbon auditing is here to stay. Having a carbon figure against your output can only be a good thing. Whether you will be able to monetize that at any point, or whether it will just be a route to market, is yet to be seen. I think, given the landscape of carbon auditing, I think it's going to be a bumpy road. If I was to check my crystal balls, they would say that on-farm carbon auditing, where the farmer is responsible for inputting their own data, is great. It would give the supply chain a quick answer. Whether that answer is accurate and is another question. I think there will come a time where the supply chain wants that third-party audited carbon figure so they could offset it against their own balance sheet, carbon balance sheet. But there's no real direction at the minute. And this is what certainly in my role, I'm finding very, very frustrating at the minute. It's I'm only selling one product, and I have 8 different ways or requests to fill out a carbon form depending on which direction I'm selling the barley in. So, I don't think that it's going to get any clearer anytime soon. But again, like I said before, there are conversations throughout the whole supply chain happening, and I hope that a sort of joined up way of thinking happens sooner rather than later, for you guys' benefit anyway.
Thanks. And I don't know, in terms of that sort of data collection and how you record it and how you frame it and everything, I don't know if that's something that might come up later in one of the other talks around the sort of data and what you do with it, and then how you kind of sell that or get reward for it. And I see there's a question up the back there, and then we're nearly out of time, so we'll start wrapping up quite soon after that.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. My name's Donald. Just a little question about yield versus pesticides. So you get a bit less yield if you don't use pesticides. Is there any demand from the supply chain to have crops with less pesticide use, less carbon, less diesel, and to pay a little bit more for a farm that can demonstrate that?
There have been occasions where a distiller will request an organic barley product be malted, but it's very, very small scale. If you were to look at the tons of malt produced in Scotland every year, there would be a huge shortfall if we were to go all organic overnight and the yield was to drop by half a tonne an acre. That's all it would take.
I'm not necessarily talking about organic. I'm just talking about, like, for my barley, I would spray it 4 times. I could just spray it 2. But I might have a little bit of a yield loss, or I could just spray it once. Or, organic is a very specialised thing to me.
Okay, so, I can tell you how many times I've been asked that question by a customer when I'm selling barley. 0. So, yeah, there we go. I've never been asked how many times the product's been sprayed. It's either organic or it's not organic. Throughput is key. They need the tons through the maltings to feed the distillers, to ensure that we produce the whiskey that as a nation we can produce, because it's a huge global market and it's growing all the time, which is phenomenal for us, especially now that there's this sort of 3-way conversation between maltsters, distillers and growers. We just have to make sure that keeps growing. And, drop me an email, ask me the question, and I can ask my supply chain and get back to you if that's something they would consider. Well, glyphosate, that's above my pay grade. I'm not good at, we'll keep using it until we're told we're not allowed to use it, basically, in the spring barley.
Thank you. Yep, there's one in the middle there.
Hello, Stuart Ferguson, a farmer. We've been hearing all about the various mitigations and things we have to do for carbon. like forestry and stock and wildflower meadows. Has anyone actually come from the other end and how much production we will lose by doing this? Because once we lose critical mass, then we lose everything downstream. So surely we should come to how much we need and then work out how much we can grow rather than coming from the other end.
Does anyone want to respond to that? I think it maybe comes into sort of diversity and you know, some things making other bits more efficient of the system if you're, you know, in a wider system approach.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. Is this still on? Yeah. And that blended approach, so it's a little bit getting into the land sparing, land sharing debate, I think. And I think, you know, there's no one simple single answer, but working together and having a mosaic approach really across the world, which is the challenge, because as I said before, if we drop our production in certain places, somewhere else will pick that up. And is that, as a global approach to adapting or mitigating against climate change, is that really the best solution? But yeah, I don't really have anything else to add. I think it's a very fair point.
Thanks. Right, I think we've got maybe time for one more question and then we'll start wrapping up.
Sorry, it's just more. It's just more of a response to that last question, and that I think it all boils down to we've all got to I come from a distilling background, so we're all parts of the supply chain need to be doing more with less, and so it's not just farmers perhaps losing some production due to climate mitigation strategies or reducing their carbon. At the other end of the scale, you know, closer to the consumer, distillers are very much working very hard to use less grain but get more alcohol at the end of the day, sort of thing. So even if we lose some production, hopefully through all the investment in, you know, sort of different strategies we're taking today, we'll still be able to at least meet what we're producing today, if not produce more and more into the future.
Thanks, that's interesting. Is there any final questions before we start wrapping up? And do any of the panellists want to make any final points to anything that we've not answered? Yeah, well, thank you very much, everybody, for your time. I think that's been quite a wide-ranging conversation there, and the sort of adapting to the changing climate kind of theme. I think that it's quite clear, it's quite complex. There's not one size fits all kind of approach, but I think the sort of themes of sharing knowledge, having more conversations with more types of people, more groups of people across supply chains, and the sort of knowledge exchange, you know, working together with breeders, farmers, supply chain, I think is where the key really is, and sort of recognising that one size doesn't fit all, but you know, there's maybe a sort of suite of things that work in different situations. So I don't think we've really come to any answers there. But yeah, hopefully that was quite a useful conversation, and thanks again to our 4 panellists, and thanks to the audience for all your excellent questions. And the next talk will be staying profitable with fewer inputs, and I think that's at 12 o'clock. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.